Hello. Every year, the United States celebrates Columbus Day on the second Monday of October. This year, it's October 13th. Today, that's the celebration. This is interesting because Christopher Columbus from Italy, from Genoa, Italy, never actually set foot in North America. He set foot in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, but not in uh, North America. The fact is that he has become for some time now, even before Donald Trump's proclamation of October 9th about Columbus Day, the Columbus Day celebration has become controversial. Holidays historically are rooted in hero worship in ancient traditions linked to religion. They go back thousands of years, and they are supposed to be a catalyst for unity and the celebration of human achievement and human creativity, of human beings transcending the boundaries of their own capabilities and doing things that are godlike, if you will, going beyond what is seemingly possible. The question, of course, is whether Christopher Columbus is a figure who represents a heroic prototype or archetype, as Joseph Campbell, the American scholar who wrote extensively on myth and heroes, or whether Christopher Columbus is, as many historians who have done research on what Columbus did and on the legacy of European colonialism and colonial explorers specifically in the Western Hemisphere, whether that is really more in the domain of an exploiter and someone who used native populations, namely the indigenous people called the Indians, of course, back then, native populations, the indigenous population, to exploit, to kill, to basically reduce to a secondary level in comparison with the Europeans, to marginalize. This is the controversy, and it comes in the 21st century during a time that there is a hardening oppositions between the far right insisting on hero worship of individuals, whether they are linked to colonialism, neo imperialism, militarism, which entail necessarily destruction and exploitation, or whether there is the position of the progressive individuals who rely more on scholarship. And this is not to say, by the way, that progressives are angels. On the contrary, but there is the question of whether hero worship and such momentous holidays like Columbus Day, for example, ought to be looked at on the basis of empirical evidence of what was actually taking place in 1492 with the exploration of the Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and to take a look at that on its own merits and not use that as a symbol for what is taking place today in order to reaffirm a political agenda which um, is about reaffirming the marginalization of pluralist of diversity and pluralism, and this is at the core. This is not, of course, to vilify anyone, but it is about the actual historical record, not manipulating, not engaging in relativism and arguing there are alternative truths. The record, the historical record, whatever Columbus did, he did. For example, wiping out the Arawak Indians in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas and other islands, eventually that they all uh, were eliminated. This is, according to some historians, a form of genocide. Whether someone in this vein deserves celebratory status in modern society, and whether someone of with a record as Columbus has deserves the sort of hero worship that Donald Trump uh, uh, asserted on October 9th when he signed a proclamation declaring Columbus Day the second week of the second Monday, sorry, of October, Columbus Day, and insisting that this individual is a figure of, of virtue, among other courage, he mentioned perseverance, faith, and so forth. Not once was there a mention of the crimes of that expedition. Not once was there a mention of the indigenous population and its fate in the hands of the explorers. Not once was there a mention of the legacy of European colonialism throughout the Western Hemisphere from Canada down to Argentina. Nothing about that. And this is despite the fact that for decades, indigenous people have made an issue of this. But there is another issue here. How Columbus Day is celebrated on October 12th, by the way, they remain true to the actual date in Latin America, Argentina, Mexico, Peru, other Caribbean, certain number of Central American and Caribbean countries. They celebrated really as a day of the fusion of European and indigenous culture. They do not celebrate the individual conqueror, but rather they celebrate cultural diffusion and the people coming together. You see, this is a fundamental difference between how the United States celebrates Columbus Day, and let's keep in mind Columbus never set foot in the United States. What is today the United States? That is North America. Okay, so that's part of the record. Now, being called a great American by a number of GOP people, and I believe Trump was one of them, is fine. They can call him a great American. He was Italian, of course, but 500 years ago. But the issue, the larger issue here, is to be accurate to what actually took place. Now, the President of the United States went on to criticize, using Columbus Day, those who have come out in the past, who have come out and said that this individual is one that does not deserve such celebratory status, that hero worship is not for such individuals who are not catalysts for constructive social cohesion and anything constructive for society, but rather they're divisive because this individual came with the expressed purpose of finding riches, gold, silver, and then, of course, collecting slaves to exploit the resources and the labor and the people of this hemisphere, which were, of course, he thought he was in India. However, the issue here is that it set a precedent for future explorers and for the colonization of the entire hemisphere and the subjugation of the indigenous people under the boot of the white Europeans. The President of the United States argued that the people who claim this slander Columbus, and they are slandering American heroes. And by taking statues from buildings and removing them of such people like Columbus and trying to replace the name Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, as did Biden, who didn't really replace it. He just joined the two, Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day, in 2021. He argues this is leftist nonsense, that it should not be tolerated, that that this is a person deserving of the status accorded to him. Now, the question, of course, is what exactly, like I said, what exactly was constructive about the Columbus expedition, other than coming here to look for riches that clearly did not belong to the Spanish monarchy or to Columbus, other than coming here to spread disease, because the Europeans, I have to mention this, by the way, 1492, in 1348, the Black Death erupted in Europe. And obviously, the first wave was the worst. But as time went on, by the end of the 15th century, what happened is more and more people became immune. They carried it, some carried the disease. They weren't getting sick from it, but they could transmit it to others. Now, isolation of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere entailed that when the Europeans, Columbus's people, other explorers who came over, when they came into contact with the indigenous population, they killed them off because they had no immunity to the diseases coming from Europe. So, this is another very important issue. To consider that that this is also part of the legacy, not to mention the marginalization, taking over their land, making it theirs. Okay, so this is the legacy of Christopher Columbus, and relegating them to second-class citizens, in some cases enslaving. Now, the fact is, there is a group of people historically in the United States that has supported, going back to the 19th century, that has supported celebrating Columbus Day, and that is the Italian American population. I believe there are about 4 million of them today in the United States out of 350 million people, roughly. They had been advocating this in the 19th century. It was not until Franklin Roosevelt in 1937 who yielded to the pressure of the Italian Americans and agreed to designate this day as a holiday, and he agreed that Columbus Day ought to celebrate this European explorer who, of course, discovered, in other words, explored, but they used the wrong word. In any case, they discovered the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. Now, The countries that celebrate holidays like this, like I said initially, do so because they want to bring the country together, they want to bring people together. They are not doing it to divide, they're doing it to unite a nation. Such celebrations, historically, especially in the modern period, are reserved for people who fought in and distinguished themselves politically, diplomatically, or in the battlefield, fought for the independence of a country, or in revolutions like the French Revolution of 1789. So the idea of such celebrations really is for independence of a country. In other words, they celebrate freedom. In the case of Columbus and the explorers, it was not freedom that they were spreading, but rather the regimentation, if not enslavement. Not to mention, of course, that because of these explorers and because the Portuguese had already gone into Africa and the slave trade had started, there is the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade once more explorers come from Europe and begin to settle in the Western Hemisphere. And then there is the active transatlantic slave trade from North America to the Caribbean to Brazil, down to Brazil. So this is not freedom. Slavery as an institution is not freedom. On the contrary, if anything, the explorers and the colonizing countries who engaged in this ought not to be celebrated and placed on a pedestal as somehow having a lofty moral position, because the Europeans themselves, based on the values of the Enlightenment, the 18th century age of reason, argued that all men, of course, this is also in the United States Constitution, are created equal before God. So the idea of subjugation, and then linking people responsible responsible for that institution, the institution of slavery, and on the other hand, having celebratory occasions for that, is a contradiction. For progressive individuals, whether they're scholars, of course, or whether they're just interested parties, political observers, and so forth, they argue that the issue here is Eurocentrism and Euro-Atlantic centrism. And the idea is that the Europeans had already developed a sense of superiority and tried to justify the institution of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery in the Western Hemisphere that followed after Columbus, after the explorers and the settlements in this hemisphere. And let's remember, Columbus was the first in this project. That institution in itself is the epitome of social injustice. In other words, they argue that one would be hard pressed to find any evidence of social justice associated with Christopher Columbus. And this is a very important point because from ancient times to the present, like I said, the fact is that societies need their heroes. They need myth and hero, and they need them. And the question is, how are those myths and heroes formulated in society, and who is responsible for it? And this is where Christopher Columbus's day, the Columbus Day celebration in America, is very important because historically, the elites who are responsible for the hegemonic culture of a society, any society, by the way, it doesn't matter where it is, throughout the history of civilizations, they mold the value system, they mold the subcultures, the hegemonic culture, which is a product of the elites, mold the subcultures at the lower socioeconomic level. They are the ones who try to do this, and they do it so that the population, that the people, that the masses accept the social contract and accept conformity to the institutional structure in which the elites are privileged. Okay, so culture is very important, and the question of who chooses these celebrations of heroes, who chooses the myths and the heroes of society. It is not some farmer out working in the fields with his family. It is not some worker in the shipyards. It is the elites, the socioeconomic and political elites that are the deciding factors. They decide throughout history because they control the institutions in society. It's no different today than it was in the Middle Ages or in 5th century Athens in the golden age of Pericles. We have today, of course, Christopher Columbus being used because there is an agenda by the government in the United States to um, ultimately, I was going to say water down, but it's actually ultimately do away with diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. We saw this very clearly in the last 9 months when Elon Musk took over for the first few months of the Trump administration the job of eliminating personnel from the bureaucracy. We see it even today, even in October 2025, when Republicans use the term Democrat bureaucrats as though the bureaucracy, which is vast, by the way, of the United States is homogeneous. It's made up only and monolithic. It's made up only of Democrats. So let's punish them. Let's get rid of these multicultural diversity types. Culture is very important, whether it's today or in history. And so Columbus Day is being used to indoctrinate, it's being used to mold the and to mold public opinion and to have the population accept the new norm of someone like Columbus, whose record, by the way, the record we cannot change. The record is what it is. The fact is, he did a number of things that resulted in mass destruction and mass murder, death. And then the legacy was much worse. The transatlantic slave trade was a reality. It's not a myth. The fact that he was here on behalf of the monarchy in Spain, he was here to take away something that did not belong to the European monarchy, to the Spanish monarchy, to the European financiers who were interested in this. The fact is that we have a record of very destructive role that Christopher Columbus played in history. And the question is this, as Howard Zinn pointed out in a long time ago, he's passed away 15 years ago or so, in a work that he did about Christopher Columbus, Is this someone that raises to the level of hero worship in a society so that the entire society has set aside a day annually to celebrate this individual? The question is, do the people, our contemporary elites today, care about Christopher Columbus or what he actually did, or are they manufacturing truth, massaging the truth, in order to use this particular holiday, which is very important to Italian Americans? And by the way, just as an aside, the fact is that Italian Americans who immigrated in the late 19th century, along with Eastern European and Southern European um, immigrants from Greece to Italy to Spain to Portugal to they immigrated to the United States, they were discriminated against. The Italians themselves became the object of discrimination. Italians became the object of discrimination. Some of them were lynched. There was no Catholic president of the United States until John F. Kennedy. He was an Italian, he was of Irish background, but there was no there was no Catholic, sorry, there was no Catholic president. There was the elites in the United States up until the early Vietnam War were Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Um, so here we have a Catholic Italian who is elevated to this level and is being used because this is a symbol of the hybrid authoritarianism that exists today in the United States. Hybrid authoritarianism needs to remold the culture. One of the reasons that the President of the United States gave the order to do away with DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, throughout the bureaucracy, to stop providing grants for such research, to clean the museums, the Smithsonian museums, from multicultural and diversity aspects. Since I have visited them many times in Washington, D.C., it is one would be hard pressed to see what would be left in many of them, not all, but in many of them, once you do eliminate what they want, and that is the multicultural aspects. That because the United States as a country was founded by a collection of people who were not indigenous, mostly Europeans, but they're from all over the world. And the enrichment of American culture, of American civilization, the greatness of American civilization from the post Civil War period to down to the 20th century, in terms of science and technology and the arts and so forth, all of that comes as a result of cultural diffusion. I am amazed why neighboring Mexico is in fact engaged in celebrating the adventures of Columbus by, without celebrating the individual, celebrating the multicultural aspect of that. Argentina, the same way, although Argentina has a large percentage of its population of Italian background, including the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, by the way, they recognize that the cultures, the European and the indigenous cultures coming together, cultural diffusion, is what enriched their societies. By contrast, the United States has decided to celebrate, engage in hero worship, except that this hero is not is an anti-hero. This is not the kind of hero that would hold up that we would hold up and meet. This is not a person who would meet uh, criteria usually reserved for someone who has played a constructive role in history. Now, the issue, there is a scholarly debate about Columbus Day and how it's used in the culture wars of America. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at Columbus Day as an integral part of the ongoing culture wars in the United States. And the question is this: is this a distraction, as some scholars have argued, and journalists, by the way, because the United States is up against a new rising world power, economically at least at this point, China, and the China led BRICS group? And the United States, we have seen, has tried desperately to engage in containment, to do all kinds of things, sanctions and so forth against China, but so far we haven't seen much by way of results. Is this a distraction also because the United States has followed a neoliberal policy which of corporate welfare and has transferred enormous amounts of income from the working class and the middle class to the richest, what Bernie Sanders calls the oligarchy? He richest 1%, I'll say 5%. You can go 10% if you like. But from the bottom 90% to the top 10%, is this a distraction to say, well, this is, if we just give you Columbus to celebrate, you should be happy? Is this a distraction placating the masses with such issues, engaging in culture wars and arguing this is what it's all about? It's culture wars. It's not class war, it's culture war. However, there's another school of thought that culture war is an integral part of class war. So if you go with the theory that the hegemonic culture is indeed an integral part of the class war and it is used in the by the elites, okay, it is used by the dominant class to mold the masses into conformity and have them be obedient, if you will, be docile, accept these heroes at a time, by the way, that the United States, let's face it, it's not a secret, the United States is engaged in a conflict with its own cities and states. And from Los Angeles, California, to Washington, D.C., to Portland, Oregon, to Chicago, Illinois, the United States government, the central government, sent sent the National Guard and immigration officers, police officers, and they are chasing down illegal immigrants. What is an illegal immigrant? They argue, well, they're criminals. Okay, they're workers. There are very few people among them, and there have been a number of studies on this, by the way, published in various journals, including in the New York Times, by the way, which indicate that the government itself, the government knows that there are very few who have committed crimes. So, and by the way, I'm including traffic stops. Okay. So the question is, what do? You grab them all. You grab the workers. You grab the child who's going to school of illegal immigrants. You grab the woman cleaning a hotel room. You grab a man who's driving a truck. You grab the workers. So this is part of But you do it because you declare these are the enemy, these immigrants. It just so happens, but this enemy, by the way, is the essence of America. The immigrant is what America is. Columbus was an invader in the Caribbean and in Latin America. Never came to the United States, never came up here to the north, but he was an invader. Europeans were invaded, they were colonized, they were worse than invaders, they were colonizers. They seized the land that didn't belong to them, eliminated and or marginalized people, transported millions from another continent to enslave them. Okay. And now the question is, how do you work? How do you make this the norm? How do you explain to your own people that this constitutes social justice when in fact, it doesn't? This is exploitation and oppression and repression. You have to create heroes out of individuals like Christopher Columbus and declare national holidays and say, here, you know what he did? He discovered America, and he is to be celebrated. He is our ancestor of 500 years ago of white Europeans, right? He happened to be Catholic, not Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which is the majority of the elites. Although clearly today there is a mixture of Catholics, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and of course people of the Jewish faith as well among those elites. Very important, by the way. Um, but for a long time, the Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite molded the hegemonic culture, and they are the ones that were interested in conformity. And conformity meant that as long as you have the masses, the middle class and the lower class, the working class, sociopolitically obedient, then the privileged elites privileges are not questioned. The idea was for the elites to retain their privileges, not to have their privileges questioned. And the privileges, of course, is exactly what is at the core of social injustice. As much back then when there were not Catholic among the elites, Catholic as well as Jews, as when they are today. So what we have here is there are several issues, and I want to end with this. There's several issues that we should take away from all of this, and that is the culture wars will continue because the United States is a hybrid authoritarian country that is a facade of democracy, while the institutional structure is slipping away toward authoritarianism. Behind the facade of electoral politics, there is the reality of policies that are designed to perpetuate the elite structure and the inequality and to end multiculturalism and diversity and to make sure that the privileges maintain what they have and continue to build on that. That's very important. Now, regrettably, of course, there is a segment of the population that goes along with this. The question is, why do they go along with it? There is a school of thought, and unfortunately, they're out there, and it includes academics, people in my field, who believe that the political leadership, the political class, is following cultural trends and culture wars, not leading and molding. There is not much evidence of that at all. When we look at Project 2025, which is basically the product of it's a document that was put together by groups of people um, some from academia, behind which are billionaires, some of the richest people in the United States, and given to Trump, and then all he's doing, and the Republican Party, and all they're doing is really realizing the goals of Project 2025, then we realize that in fact there is no such thing as the elites following the followers. It is the elites manipulating through the media, which they control, which is tightly controlled and an oligopoly. There are very few. When you trace the mainstream media and the social media, it is abundantly clear that there are very few elements that control it, and those are all multimillionaires and billionaires, and they have a common interest to mold public opinion so that they they engender conformity among the population. I'm not surprised at all, by the way, that the hybrid authoritarian regime is seeking to, in fact, um, create to whitewash and to elevate Christopher Columbus and to elevate Columbus into the position of a hero and elevate this individual to such a level that the um, that those who want to believe in the myth rather than the reality of what he actually did, because when you have the elites in the last 2 years, supporting a war in Israel that the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and the United Nations label genocide. International human rights organizations, including Israeli ones, former Israeli officials, when they label genocide, Senator Sanders, I believe, also has come to that conclusion. When the elites have no qualms about denying that there has been genocide in Gaza in the last 2 years, since October 2023, why would they have any qualms about Christopher Columbus 500 years ago committing genocide, wiping out the Arawak Indians in the Caribbean? So the why not celebrate the conqueror, the white master? There is an element of racism here. There is an element of Eurocentrism, of the white supremacist mindset and social Darwinism, the late 19th century ideology on which the Third Reich unfortunately rested on. That there is, in fact, social hierarchy and there is a sense of racial superiority. And this, of course, is where culture comes in, because through culture, the hegemonic elites make sure that the masses accept the social contract and the elites in the dominant role as a given, as a norm. So that is an important point. I believe that the issue of resistance, and this is the last point I'll make, is an important one. There has been resistance. There is resistance when you look at the streets of Chicago and the streets of Los Angeles and the streets of Portland, Oregon. And when we look at what is planned for October 18th, the No King's Day in America, which of course the Republicans label the hate American demonstrations. It's not a hate American demonstrations. They love America. They don't want hybrid authoritarianism. When you look at this picture, one cannot be optimistic about the use of cultural icons like Columbus as a vehicle to carry through a message, and that is the message of a monolithic society rather than a pluralistic society, which has been the catalyst to success of America and American civilization. I thank you for listening. I ask you to please ask questions, write any comments, and by all means, join this channel. Thank you.